I am most delighted to introduce Dr. Anthony Chambers. Not only is he a very talented and brilliant psychologist, he's also a very kind, relatable, and gentle person. And I have so much appreciated his warmth as well as his knowledge. Dr. Anthony Chambers is the Chief Academic Officer at the Family Institute at Northwestern University. He is also the Director of Northwestern University Center for Applied Psychological and Family Studies. Also a clinical professor in the Department of Psychology. He is the former president of the American Psychological Association Society for Couple and Family Psychology and past president of the American Academy of Couple and Family Psychology. Currently, he serves on the board of directors for the American Psychological Association. Now, this is only a tiny bit of what he has done. For a more detailed bio, you can go to Ackerman's website and read it. And if you really want to know all that he has done, I suggest that you Google him. You will see that he's an extraordinary person and has done many wonderful things. And with that, I am most honored, delighted to present Dr. Anthony Chambers.
Oh, well, thank you so much for that incredibly kind and generous introduction. Marlene, Dr. Watson, you have just been a dear friend and a dear colleague. And so I so appreciate this invitation to be able to be here today, to really be able to talk about one of the topics that I am most passionate about, which is about African-American couples. So let me see here if I got the technology right. I'm going to try to share my screen here. Okay, perfect. Thank you again for being able to, for all of you who are attending tonight, to be able to watch this lecture, as well as for those of you who will be watching it in the future. The title of this lecture is The Legacy of Racism on Black Couples, Translating Social Science into Culturally Informed Clinical Practice. So as Dr. Watson mentioned, I am a psychologist, and I do also a lot of clinical work. So in addition to the different scholarly things and my administrative responsibilities, I will also say at the center of my heart and soul is actually clinical work. I really enjoy working with couples. It's really why I got into this field, and something that is just very near and dear to my heart. And so one of the things when I try to give these sorts of lectures is to try to make this as practical as possible. We're going to talk about some of the larger systemic issues that are present right now that are impacting African-American couples, but I'm also really going to spend a large part of this lecture to hopefully give it so you can be able to go into a therapy room with one of your next clients and be able to actually ask very thoughtful questions, being able to maybe look or conceptualize your couple in a different way, and as well as to be able to hopefully guide the interventions that you're going to be using. So today we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to start off talking a little bit about the historical and sociological considerations of sort of the African-American couple experience. And then as I begin to talk about some of that literature in the sociological field, for instance, we're going to then sort of use that to translate that into actual psychological and interpersonal and different clinical issues unique to African-Americans. Now, you see here that I have two special subpopulations of African-American couples that I think are really important to talk about too. So one is interracial couples, and I'm going to talk a bit about how the whole population of interracial couples has actually really increased significantly. And if you're going to be working with African-American couples, a good chance you're also going to be having interracial couples that are going to be coming into your office. And so I'm going to talk tonight about that. And then step families, and I'm going to share some data about that, but it's one of the things that we don't get nearly enough training in working with, but it's such a complicated yet rich and prevalent area that I think is really an important part to the African-American experience. And so I am going to spend a little bit of time talking about that as well. And then we will conclude tonight by talking about how to conduct culturally sensitive couple therapy. So I want to start by actually showing a clip. This is from an ESPN film on Derek Jeter. Derek Jeter is a very famous former baseball player, recently retired. He is biracial. His father is African American. His mother is white. And there's a really interesting clip sort of that kind of talks about that experience and how others perceive him. And so I wanted to be able to share that, as well as I think it's a couple other things in that clip that will help to sort of also contextualize what we're going to do here tonight. So let me stop sharing my screen. And I think, Christy, you can be able to pull up the video. Great.
I'll give you a couple of reasons why Derek wasn't asked questions about social issues and all. First of all, it almost seems as if he had set the ground rules. Not that he told us, don't ask me about these things, but the non-committal nature of his answers. You would think, should I ask Jeter this, or will he even answer it? He probably won't answer it, so don't bother. That's number one. Number two, Derek Jeter does not identify racially. I don't think he does. You know, he just never, he just seems to be racially neutral. Derek Jeter was almost colorless. I mean, not only physically, but also, you know, in the way he spoke.
Who the fuck are you? And that's what I would say. You know what I mean? Seriously, you think about it. How the fuck does he know? That's the first thing I would say. How does he know? Because he just admitted he doesn't ask the question. So if you don't ask the question, how do you know? I don't think I've ever heard someone being defined as colorless. I don't think. I'm just trying to, I don't think I've ever heard that.
Colorless. Interesting. I don't even know how to answer that. I've never heard someone say that they thought someone was colorless.
Don't know who he is, don't care to know who he is. You know, I don't know if anybody with any kind of sense could come up with something as dumb as that, you know, really.
He doesn't know anything about Derek.
Why do we go to an athlete to ask him about a social issue? I mean, do we ask the President of the United States about an athletic issue? You know, do we do that? No, we don't, right? I mean, you try to keep people in their lane.
That just sounds like an old school mentality right there. That's what we're trying to change. That, man. Stay in your lane? Come on, man. What lane is his lane? Like, what enables him to be the one that can talk about it? And we can't.
You grow up in America, you're African American, there's every day of your life you have to think about, why am I treated differently? Why do I not have the same opportunities? Why do I have to be taught that you have to be better than your white counterpart just to have an equal opportunity?
The fans started letting me have it in Milwaukee. Here I am, a 19-year-old kid. Imagine what you was doing at 19 years old. I'm having to fight off all of this, and all I wanted to do was play baseball.
A day doesn't go by, you don't think about what is going to happen to me today that wouldn't happen to the average American.
If Derek Jeter was out there talking about the issues that black people were facing, the public would have turned on him as well. Because the public turns on everybody who calls out American racism. The black tax is the price you pay. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of black players don't speak out, because not everybody can afford it.
Right. So, you know, that clip, when I first saw it, it was quite powerful, you know, to me. You know, this idea of what is it, who gets to define sort of who you are, the stress that African Americans go through, including even looking at Derek Jeter as, you know, also an African American who's biracial. You know, this idea of sort of colorless and how other people perceive you. Those are all stressors and things that we have to be able to manage and to cope with. And when I think about couples, and I think about the couples who are in my office and I'm working with, one of the questions I'm always asking is about is how are things at work? How are the things that, what is it like for you right now in your world and the stressors that you're dealing with? Because we know that all of these stressors are things that we bring home. These are things that we carry with us. They impact our capacity to be able to be in a relationship, to be able to give to our families. And this, and I think the last gentleman said it well, it's the black tax. And I think those sorts of things that help to contextualize what oftentimes African Americans are having to hold on to and bring into their relationships, which is the reason why I wanted to be able to show that, because we're going to talk about the interracial couples in a bit. We're going to start off though with African American couples, but all of it really, to me, starts to contextualize the importance of being able to understand what it is that we are going through, and particularly how we then bring that and show up into our relationships. So I want to be able to also just give some acknowledgements in terms of for this lecture here for tonight. So a portion of this presentation has been, it sort of comes from different articles and things that I have recently written. So one is an article in Family Process, the Black Lives Matter movement, a call to action for couple and family therapists with some of my terrific colleagues. That's one of the recent ones that we did that I was really happy with, sort of post George Floyd, and starting to think about all the different things that came up around that. Also done an article on African American couples in the 21st century, also using integrative systemic therapy. That is an approach that myself and several of my colleagues here at the Family Institute use, and I was being able to apply that approach to working with African American couples. An article that I wrote now a while ago, can't believe it's been over a decade here, but understanding the disproportionately low marriage rate amongst African Americans, an amalgam of sociological and psychological constraints that published in Family Relations. And then one of my colleagues here at the Family Institute, Dr. Horvitz, did a dissertation on biracial identity development. And so that all of these are things that I used and are going to be reflected in different parts of this presentation here tonight. So I like to start off by giving some important caveats here. One, there is a lot of heterogeneity within any racial or ethnic group. You know, one of the things that I'm always mindful of when talking about African American couples, or even when I'm attending other lectures, I'm always mindful and careful about the fact that, you know, it's hard to be able to think about how do you explain the entire experience within 90 minutes or 2 hours or an hour for that matter, you know, or even for a course, for an entire course that you might take. It's almost impossible to really capture the full complexity that exists within any racial or ethnic group. And so I always like to be able to give that caveat out here as we're beginning to talk through about things. For every example that I will bring, there's another example that will counter that. I think it's just an important piece to be able to put out there. Another one is that, you know, even though we are, you know, myself as a therapist, and for those of you who are therapists who are listening to this, or even researchers who are focused on trying to understand and researching African Americans, we disproportionately focus on problems. We focus on the concerns or issues that are there. But I think it's so important to realize that resiliency, strength are really hallmarks of minority families. They are really critical resources for therapists to be able to use in helping minority couples. And that's true, of course, with African American couples, with interracial couples, or any minority couple. And so again, I think it's a really important piece that we don't lose sight of the resiliency and the strength. I think that's such an important part, that a resource that needs to be tapped into and is absolutely as important as the problems and the concerns that will bring any particular couple or family into our offices. So why is this topic controversial? And there's several things here I'm going to talk about in this slide and also in the next one. So one is that it's heteronormative, right? It really wasn't until recently that marriage was not widely available to same-sex couples, and the conversation is usually about heterosexual relationships. It's also not acceptably feminist to need or even want a man, or to need a father for one's children. Because this topic has undertones of saying that it's Black women's fault, that Black women are too demanding, picky, angry, independent, sexually frigid, successful, and desperate. Or it also highlights the racial segregation in the marriage market, that Black women are less likely to marry outside of their race. And it also highlights the biological clock for women who want children, and is the cause of out-of-wedlock births. What does it say about Black men? Well, Black men are either dead, in jail, gay, HIV positive, or on the down low. They are educationally or occupationally unattractive mates. That it has this idea that women are just having to settle. That they are two-timing because of being in high demand by both Black and non-Black women, that women expecting or even normalizing male infidelity because of the prevalence, and that Black men are not driven by biological clock imperatives. Now, obviously, these are stereotypes. Obviously, these are, gross exaggerations. However, there are elements to some of these different narratives that couples do have. And I'm going to try to infuse throughout this lecture different examples and things along those lines. But some of these are narratives that for the couples that will come into your office, they may embrace or have or believe one or more of these different narratives. And I think it's partly also an important thing for the therapist to be able to understand and realize that, yeah, it's also controversial. There's a lot of different feelings out there. So I'd like to be able to name the controversies that are out there so that we can at least be able to be aware of that as we're trying to be able to digest and metabolize some of the different information and things that we're going to talk about here. So historical considerations, it was a myth to say that slavery was, completely responsible for unstable African-American families. In fact, census data and marriage license show that two-parent families were the dominant family structure in 1860. So, the fact that, we think that, oh, well, it was all because of slavery, that there were really never ever any marriages until post-slavery actually just isn't true. Now, it's also true, though, that many slaves did not have intact nuclear families, and thus they relied on an extended family structure. And that's also been talked about in terms of the resiliency and some of the flexibility that African Americans have had in terms of the family structure that we've used. And it's also true that slaves experienced forced reproduction. And I'm going to stop this and I'm going to show a clip. I think this last part is particularly, this last point I think is a really interesting one. For those of you who have not had a chance to read this, the 1619 Project, highly recommended. It's an incredible book. And there's also a mini series on Hulu about the 1619 Project. And when I first, read about that and then, listen to that, every time it strikes me. I mean, there's just so much to be able to unpack there. But the one piece that I want to sort of pull out from that was that in addition to that being sort of forced reproduction, it was also forced infidelity. When you begin to think about two individuals, despite their romantic relationships, their husband or their wives, that they were forced to actually engage in infidelity, and starting to think about, what does that mean, and how are there any particular coattails from that we're still dealing with today when you begin to think about infidelity that occurs. And so I leave that as something for you to be able to ponder. But I think it was a powerful way to think about some of our relationships and some of the things that have really happened to us. And I think there's some interesting remnants of some of that that's still going on here even today. So let's talk about the current state of African-American marriages. So one of the things that U.S. Census data shows us is that African-Americans, we have the lowest marriage rate and the highest divorce rate. And if you just sit back and think about that, when you think about this old adage, right, this idea that the backbone of any society is the family. And what does that mean when we think about that we have the lowest marriage rate and the highest divorce rate of any racial and ethnic group, and that the marriage rate has actually continued to decrease over the past 50 years? And there's some interesting data that kind of also that helps to be able to highlight this. So if you look at the graph here on the left, you'll see that I think two things should hopefully point out to you. So from 1960 to 2008, the marriage rate has decreased for all racial and ethnic groups. So that's true. This is for with Blacks, whites, and Hispanics. So for all three, they have decreased. However, if you look at the African-American line, it's a steeper slope. And so there's been a more dramatic decrease relative to other racial and ethnic groups. This is also highlighted on this slide here when you look at Black men compared to white men. And you see back in 1950, there was a difference, but not, again, fairly close in terms of very similar in terms of the percent of men who were ever married. And if you look at that over until 2010, for the Black men, it is just, the slope is just so much more significant. It has also decreased for white men, but you look at it for Black men, it has really decreased. And so when you begin to think about, these different findings, one of the things that I think people who have really written the most about this, to be honest, are actually folks in other fields, such as anthropology, sociology, demography. And I think one of the things that when I first started entering into this field, the importance of being able to read from those different journals to see what other scholars were saying, because there's just so much rich information about what's happening amongst African Americans and African American couples in particular. And that's really where I started. And so I'm going to start this presentation here, this portion of it, talking about what are some of the sociological findings that we're starting to see out there. And so one of them is this unbalanced sex ratio, right? That there are higher rates of unemployment for African-American men. And that has gone on to be able to say that there's really a lack of marriageable African-American men due to their high mortality, substance use, and incarceration rates. I've seen some studies that show that there's only about 43 marriageable African-American men compared to 100 African-American females. And that compares to 63 males for whites and to 100 females, white females. And so, I think what's also, I went to historically Black college and university. So one of the things, if you end up taking Dr. Watson's suggestion and Googling me, read my bio that I graduated from Hampton University, which is a historically Black college and university in Virginia. And I remember vividly when I got to Hampton, just that it was very noticeable that the number of women compared to men, it was at least 3 to 1. I heard some people say it was 8 to 1. I'm not sure if it was quite that high, but it was at least 3 to 1, if not higher. And this idea of what does that sort of mean for us as a society when we think about those sorts of gender disparities, I think is really striking. And so when I saw this, I came across these studies that really helped to sort of bolster the experience that I had even as an undergrad. I thought it was really powerful and impactful to me. And I think a real thing that we need to think as a society, what does this mean? Because there is something about the gender piece, period, as you see white men are also relative to women. But again, it's just so much more stark here with African American men. Financial constraints. So even among middle class, African American position in the middle class is more tenuous than it is for Caucasians. I've actually, some of the writings that I have done has focused a lot on middle class African American couples, probably because there's just not a lot written about them. And to think that middle class African American couples also don't struggle or don't have challenges, I think is a missed opportunity to be able to have a better understanding of how to be able to work with this population. And so one of the examples from this, again, not a lot of literature on it, but one of my colleagues actually here at Northwestern, Mary Patillo, who was the sociologist, and she was a former chair of the African American Studies Department here at Northwestern. She's done a lot of work on African American middle class families, period. And one of the things that she came up with, realized through her research, is that middle class African Americans have a 2.6 higher odds of having a poor sibling than middle class Caucasians. And that even the neighborhood that they reside in tends to have a lower income compared to Caucasians. We're going to talk about this in a bit here, but I think it has a really profound impact to start to think about. And there's a missed opportunity if we just assume that, if you're middle class, that there aren't any challenges, that actually I would contend actually is not completely accurate, that there are some unique challenges that also need to be understood. For cohabitation, there are some racial differences amongst women in cohabitation unions. So cohabitation tends to be a precursor for Caucasian women, but it's really an alternative for marriage for African American women. 70% of African American births occur outside the context of marriage. That number, that statistic was really striking to me. I knew that there was, it was happening, it was occurring. But when I realized, wow, 70% of all African American births are born outside the context of marriage, and starting to think about the implications of that was really quite profound for me. And Caucasian women were the least likely to conceive a child outside of the cohabitating union compared to African American women, who were the most likely. Again, we're going to talk here in a bit about how do we start to think about some of these findings and what does it mean when someone shows up in your office? How do we begin to intervene and think about that? Also, and so one hypothesis that sometimes people have was, well, maybe African Americans don't value marriage, and it's not something that's there, and that's why there's the low marriage rate. Well, actually, despite these stats, married and never married men and women, when they've done studies, and including qualitative and quantitative studies, they show that actually they still actually really value marriage despite having the high divorce rate. Now, what is interesting is that for African American men and women, once they are divorced, they did believe that marriage was not as important. Not that it was completely, it wasn't important at all, but it wasn't as important as before. But again, it is still something that a lot of African Americans still value and see some of the benefits of being able to be married despite this high divorce rate. So now, when I think about some of those different findings that are out there that I just mentioned, I think it's really important to realize that those sociological, structural issues, the systemic issues that we know are present, are really an important, play an important role and really do impact couples and their families and things along those lines. However, it's also true that sociological factors are only going to explain a small portion of the disproportionately low marriage and high divorce rate. And so it's really becomes important to understand what are some of these interpersonal manifestations of sociological findings. And this is where I really started becoming interested in this idea of how do we translate some of that information and those things that were the findings that have been so helpful in some of the other fields of study. How does that apply to the work of us in behavioral sciences who are therapists and working with couples day to day? And, one of the things that I'm always sort of thinking about is that, look, there is no social policy that is going to change what happens between a couple behind closed doors. And I think that is something that we have to be able to take into consideration. And I think this is where there's a real opportunity. I think for all of us as therapists who are working with couples, this is where we have the opportunity to really make a profound impact because we can be able to help, we get to see what is happening behind closed doors and being able to help the couples to be able to have the kind of relationship that they need. The other reason I think this is, again, when you think about these stats about we have the lowest marriage rate, the highest divorce rate, one of the things that, always comes up to me is when I think about that many young African-American couples, they just don't have a healthy model for a healthy marriage. When couples are coming into my office, this is one of the things that I'm oftentimes thinking about. So we think about the low marriage rate, high divorce rate, 70% of African-American children being born out of wedlock. Yeah, it's hard to be able to know, well, how do you go about, having a healthy relationship? And one of the things that I will say, mention in a lot of my lectures of different types when it comes to relationships is that the central task of marriage is the management of differences. This is one of my old colleague up at Harvard Medical School, Anne Fischel. She was one of my mentors, and she talked about that. And that statement has just resonated with me and really is core to everything that I do when I begin to work with couples, which is how do you go about managing differences? No matter who you select, you are never going to marry your clone. And it's the couples who are able to manage their differences well, they tend to have a higher marital relationship satisfaction. Couples who don't manage their differences well tend to have a lower marital satisfaction. Now, whether or not, that's completely different from thinking about, okay, what's going to be the real predictor of divorce and things along those lines. There's a lot more complications that go into when you try to think about the predictors of divorce. But when you're just talking about sort of the engine of the relationship and trying to look at satisfaction, it's our ability to be able to manage differences. And having the absence of having a healthy model for that can really constrain our ability to be able to know how to be able to manage our differences effectively. And so, managing differences requires flexibility, right? And when you talk to any couples therapist, they will tell you oftentimes what couples are doing, there's a lot of rigidity, a lot of back and forth. So I feel like almost a tug of war when couples are in your office. And so it's being able to help to introduce this idea of flexibility. And how do you help couples to be able to have a more nuanced understanding of things, a less individualized perspective of things, of this sort of right-wrong dialectic, which we know is never helpful for being able to manage your differences, but being able to have a more nuanced understanding that managing differences is going to require flexibility, that we can both have a different perspective that's not about either of us being right or either of us being wrong. It's just different. Different is just what that is. It's not a right or wrong, it's just different. And being able to help couples with that. And so again, the lack, I think, of having a healthy model really produces rigidity and can really constrain our ability to manage differences. And so again, I think that's a really important piece that I use. And I'm going to talk about this tonight too when I get to working with also talking about interracial couples and things along those lines. But I hope that you will hold on to that part as we're going through this here. So we, given the gender disparities that we're just talking about from the sociological literature and the unbalanced sex role, it can really be difficult to delineate gender roles. And the lack of clarity around gender roles can really bring about power struggles and conflict over leadership. This is probably one of the ones that I see probably most frequently for couples that are coming into my office. They are oftentimes caught in these different power struggles. And some of that data that I mentioned is, again, it's actually fairly prevalent. And so when I'm working with a couple and I'm seeing that kind of dynamic, all of a sudden I'm having to start to think through about gender roles and power struggles and things along those lines. So for instance, the traditional male role as the provider is often challenged or surpassed by the woman. We know that that's also quite common. It's also true, secondly, that the woman can often still maintains the role as the primary caregiver of their children. And third, her unique role of being the mother may also put her in the position of being the household manager. So she's a household manager, she's the primary caregiver to children, and she may oftentimes be just as, if not oftentimes even more often than not, the primary breadwinner. So what does that mean here? Well, you get it can really be a recipe for conflict, that women will oftentimes feel very understandably feeling overwhelmed. That I need some help, I need a partner in all this, I'm doing all of this here, and they're just feeling overwhelmed and stressed. And then the man may understandably feel emasculated and feel as though that he has little to no influence in decision making. I can think about a couple that I'm working with right now. We literally spent several sessions just on this. We walked through how do we start to think about what does a partnership mean and what does that look like now? Because that is something that was really hard for this couple when they were trying to navigate their marriage and all these different roles. And again, I think this is something when you're working with African American couples, a good chance you're going to see some version of that dynamic in one of the, at least some of the couples that you're working with. Another significant issue that I think disproportionately affects African-American couples is that of boundaries and privacy. So many African-American couples have to balance obligations to their partner and to their extended families. It goes back to that data that I was mentioning from my colleague, Mary Patillo, that you're much more likely to have a sibling, for that matter, a family member who is having to rely on you, who needs help. And that can sometimes then constrain the partner's current relationship and what's happening there. And these issues, I think, are particularly salient among some African-American couples because, three-generational households are actually not uncommon amongst African-American couples. The work by Dr. Melvin Wilson, he's probably one of my favorites when it comes to thinking about three-generational households, and has done a lot of work in this area within African-American family structures. It's a fairly common thing, and so it's something that we have to be aware of. And so this idea of multiple allegiances often taking the form of sometimes financial assistance or giving financial assistance or needing to receive financial assistance from family members. It can be, can really cause a burden because either way, that co-financial dependence has the potential to result in marital conflict around the appropriate amount of money to either give or receive. Money is the #1 reason why couples get divorced. And it's not just about how much you have, it's about these other psychological variables. It's about issues of trust or fairness and who's the priority and things along those lines that where money really, as what money represents, it really can become difficult. And so this is something too, I can think of many couples that I've treated over the past where there was a lot of angst over this issue. Understandably, a person wants to be able to take care of a family member, and that family member really needs them to be able to help. But then their spouse is feeling like, well, okay, that's maybe fine and good, but guess what? We have financial obligations, and so you're then prioritizing them over my current family, over your current family now. And so having to help couples to be able to have healthy, non-reactive conversations around these difficult issues becomes really important. There can also be conflict over the appropriate amount of information to share with family members. So in these 3-generational households, privacy and boundaries becomes really an issue that you have to be quite explicit about. So when I'm working with a couple and a couple comes in and they are talking about that they are living with a grandparent, I'm going to ask a lot more questions early on about how that is working for them, because I know that when you have multiple generations living in a household, information flow can really get tricky. And the goal is not to cut off family members, but rather the goal is to create a both and, where the couple is engaged in a joint decision-making process. And so this idea was information flow. Some of the trickiest cases of infidelity that I've treated actually were not the sexual ones, but it's around information flow. It was around one person sharing information about, hey, my spouse and I, we just got into this, into this fight, and this is what he told me, and this is what's going on. He's dealing with this, or she's dealing with that. And the other person feeling like, I can't believe you sat there and shared that information. I didn't give you permission to share that information about my life with your parents or with your sibling. And so, what I'm always very mindful when a couple comes in of trying to help them to walk through that whole process of, okay, how does a decision get made around whether or not to reach out and to share that with a significant, with a family member, or a spouse, a parent or a sibling. Being able to really be mindful of that, I think, is a really important piece. And I think there's a real opportunity as a real powerful intervention as a therapist, if you can help that couple to be able to think through that, because oftentimes there's no malintent, but they're just used to and comfortable talking to their parent or to their sibling about issues. And so it's being able to try to normalize that while at the same time realizing the unintended consequences that can come from that. And so when it comes to making a decision, conjoint decision-making, I think that's a really important piece. I actually sometimes think about decision-making as sort of the window into the health of a relationship, because joint decision-making, when a couple is able to do that well, you can really sort of think that they have a lot of positive strengths and resiliency that I think is going to be really important, a really important asset that I'm going to try to tap into. But when there isn't a joint decision-making process, and you realize one person's just making a decision, and they rather ask for forgiveness instead of asking for permission, that whole sequence can really become problematic, and something that I really try to help couples work through. Again, metaphorically, I think the goal is similar to a door with 2 locks, that each of them have a key, and in order for that door to open, both members of the couple have to be able to turn the lock, and neither person has the master key. That becomes a real important part, that you can't just go and override your partner in this. Both of you have to be able to stay together and talk through things, so that you're working, so the decision can really feel like it's conjoined. I'm a big believer in using this metaphor of that. It's sort of like you both want to be co-authors of the book of your life. Both of you should feel like that you can see your thumbprint on the life that you're choosing to live, and neither of you should feel like a footnote. Both of you should feel like that you're co-authors of your life, and I think that's such an important piece for being able to help couples to work through things. Another important interpersonal context is the cohabitation. And so, right, as I mentioned earlier, cohabitation for African Americans is oftentimes a substitute for marriage, which can create challenges for understanding commitment. So research shows that premarital cohabitation is linked to less dedication for men. Some of the work by my dear friends and colleagues, Scott Stanley, Galena Rhodes, and Howard Markman, they've just done some phenomenal work in this area, and really encourage you to be able to take a look at some of their work for what they've done. But this idea of cohabitation without plans to marry is really linked to lower levels of relationship satisfaction, and I think can be a really important thing for couples therapists to be able to help couples work with, because the clinician needs to be able to help to understand the decision-making process around the decision to cohabitate. So one of the things that my colleagues have talked about, they talk about this idea of sliding versus deciding. And that one of the things that you really want to help couples to be able to not do is to be able to make a huge relationship decision, which cohabitation is, the decision to try to be able to say, hey, we want to cohabitate. That's a big relationship decision. So that relationship decision should be based on relationship factors. Are we in a place where we feel comfortable, we feel like that we are ready to cohabitate, that we want to be able to test out to see what is it like for us to be able to cohabitate? Unfortunately, what oftentimes can happen is that it's really that decision is made through the lens of convenience, meaning that, someone's lease is up. And so, hey, well, you come over here a lot anyway, my lease is up. Hey, do you want to cohabitate? And that carries a whole host of risk that I won't go into a lot of detail here today, but this idea of that you want to help couples to decide and use their relationship to make that decision versus just sliding into that decision. And so clinicians need to also understand for couples who are coming in that, again, maybe cohabitating, but they're not married, and they're not married yet, but they're also obviously still in a relationship, trying to understand what are the constraints that are preventing couples from either terminating the relationship or progressing the relationship to marriage. That cohabitation, if they haven't had a good decision-making process around it, can feel like it's almost in the state of purgatory. If okay, well, what are we doing here? Because we feel like we're not moving one way or the other. And so when the couples are coming in, I'm trying to be able to help them say, hey, let's have a good conversation about this, and let me help you be able to come to hopefully a good decision that the two of you can feel good about what the future of this relationship holds, and make sure that the two of you are on the same page about what those expectations are. Because one of the things that, again, Scott Stanley in particular has talked about is that men can oftentimes have a very different idea about what cohabitation means in terms of their commitment to being in that relationship relative to women. And so again, wanting to make sure that both members of the couple are equally aligned about what they're doing and why they're making these decisions. Finally, I think it's also important to understand possible work stress on the relationship, especially in men, because work stress really that's perceived as racism can take a huge toll of feeling vulnerable in a relationship. For both men and women, this idea that, for Black men and Black women, the amount of stress that you're sometimes having to deal with if you're in an environment that's toxic, where you're dealing with a lot of racism, you don't feel like that you're getting promoted, you feel like that you're getting blamed for things, and you're looking at it through the lens of race. Well, what that can really do is that it really can decrease your capacity to be able to feel vulnerable. And one of the things that I'm a firm believer is that in order for any relationship to be successful, it's going to be predicated on the idea that each individual has the capacity to be vulnerable. That capacity is a really important piece. And if a couple doesn't have, when I'm doing my assessment, when I'm working with couples, that's one of the things I'm oftentimes looking for. What's their capacity to be vulnerable? And when there's racism that's in place in what's happening, that can really constrain even further. And the reason I also put on there for men is that men also, we know, have even unique challenges already with knowing how to be vulnerable, but then we layer that on with the racial issues. It can be a real recipe for challenges. And so one of the things I think as a clinician, to really be mindful of being able to understand how are they coping, how are they talking to each other, how are they using whatever may have happened as either something to be able to help to bring them together, or something that is pulling them apart. Because work stress, again, can really exacerbate or decrease our tolerance for managing differences. Central task of marriage, the management of differences. And so when you are struggling with issues of power and vulnerability that's already happening, in the workplace, you sometimes don't have that same, you don't have the bandwidth sometimes to be able to then do that at home. But yet we're going to have to find a way to help you to be able to cope, so that you can be able to help hopefully use your relationship as an opportunity to restore, rather than have it be something that drains your relationship even further. So again, really being able to make sure that work stress, you want to make sure that it does not get in the way of being able to increase their ability to handle conflict, to be able to have commitment towards each other. And connecting one's home with a source of stress can be just a real serious threat to the integrity of the relationship. If you're already tired and you're already burned out here with things that are happening at home, well, you know what can end up happening then is you don't have the bandwidth to be able to do things. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, going home, that's just a source of stress. And once you start having that narrative going off in your head, that can be a real risk factor. So I think it becomes important to really be mindful of that. There's also this, what I call the special focus factor, which is trust. given the unique history of mistrust between African Americans and numerous facets of our society, I think it's a real interesting backdrop for understanding trust. In fact, research has shown that African Americans are more likely to have non-clinical paranoia, which is a cultural phenomenon stemming from the long history of racism and discrimination with multiple facets of our society. And that unique history of having trust broken, I think, can really be germane to this idea of forgiveness, right? If you're working with a couple, at some point, you're going to be dealing with infidelity. That is one of the most common, actually, it's the most common reason that brings couples into therapy, is infidelity. And so when African-American couples coming in, I'm sometimes thinking about, what is their ability or their sort of experience with sort of forgiveness. And is that something that they've even dealt with? So in fact, research has shown that African-American women are less forgiving than the Caucasian women when it comes to infidelity. I've seen that. I've also seen, interestingly, that also sometimes African-American women have put up an emotional wall in anticipation of expecting their partners to cheat. And I've also seen where the African-American men have sometimes, unfortunately, had minimized, what's happening because they are so used to seeing some of their other friends who have also cheated. So all of these things become these external factors come and show up in the therapy room in a very, I think, unique way. And the therapist must really assess each person's past experiences with forgiveness and each person's current level of resentment. And assessing, I think, mistrust from the vantage point of understanding the broader function of skepticism can really facilitate the therapeutic alliance. Because again, these things here are not just because this person doesn't want to forgive. There's a history, there's a context, and it's important for us to be able to understand that context if we're going to be in a position of being able to best help and being able to approach this with sympathy, with empathy, and care and clarity. And I think all of those are really important pieces, for dealing with this. All right, so I'm going to switch gears here now, and I'm going to talk a bit about interracial couples. Again, one of the things that we'll start to show and talk about that interracial couples is something that is on the rise, and it's a population that I think requires an awful lot of extra attention, and it's becoming more and more prevalent. And so I think being able to understand and to work with some of the unique experiences for interracial couples becomes a really important opportunity for all of us as clinicians. So I'm going to follow the similar format that I did before. So looking at the sociological and historical considerations. At one point, 40 out of 50 states in the Union at one time had laws making marriage between whites and persons of color illegal. And it really wasn't until the 1967 decision of Loving versus the Virginia Supreme Court that made interracial marriages legal. If you haven't seen the movie on that case of Loving, I really highly recommend it. It's very well done and really provided a lot of interesting, I think, context and information about what that was like. Well, let's take a look at the history of this. So in the 17th century, colonization and Christianity really led to the hierarchy of races. There's a whole entire lecture that we could do and talking about sort of race and what that actually is. But then we sort of fast forward to the 1860s, the 1863 and 1865. You had the abolishment of slavery in the United States. And then the early 20th century, even though the slavery was abolished, again, we have to think about some of the history of white supremacy that has continued to persist. There was the actual one-drop rule, which was a law created in the United States as a way to continue this hierarchy of the races, that if you have one drop of African-American, well, then you're African-American and you were denied some of the other benefits and privileges that white Americans were able to have. And again, it wasn't until the 1960s, which wasn't that long ago, that all of a sudden, during the civil rights movement, that interracial marriages became legal. And then it wasn't until 2000, which is just still mind-blowing to me, that the census allowed for multiple boxes to be checked under race. I think that's a fairly recent phenomenon that we're talking about here. And so the current state of interracial marriages, it's increasing with the numbers more than doubling over the past 30 years. Public acceptance of such unions is also increasing. And the next slide, I'm going to share and talk a little bit more about that. But here's an example, too, of just the prevalence. That interracial marriages counted for less than 1% in 1970, shortly after that, Loving versus the Virginia Supreme Court, to almost 6% in 2000, 15% in 2010, and almost 20% in 2020. So again, going from 1% to 20% here is really, that is not an insignificant number of individuals who are in these interracial marriages. And looking at all married couples in 2010, regardless of when they got married, reached an all-time high of 8.4% compared to 3.2% in 1980. So children who are living in interracial families have also quadrupled to more than 3 million between 1970 and 2000. And among all newlyweds in 2010, 9% of whites married outside of their race, along with 17% of African Americans, 26% of Hispanics, and 28% of Asians, including Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. And yet 24% of African American men who have married outside of their race in 2010, compared to 9% for African American females. Right, we go back to the very beginning of this, where we started tonight, and one of the first slides that I brought out there around that most Black women are not marrying outside of the race relative to African American men. Again, another source of controversy and another, I think, important backdrop for some of the things that are happening. African Americans who did marry whites tended to have higher educational attainment compared to marriages of folks who had same race couples. So public perceptions, I mentioned, is also changing about interracial marriages. About 43% of Americans believe that more intermarriages is a change for the better within society, while only 10% that said it was a change for the worse. A very recent study, so this is, I thought, very interesting. In 1958, when the Gallup first surveyed Americans' approval for marriages between Black and white people, only 4% approved in 1958. Fast forward to 2021, that number skyrocketed to 94% approval and only 4% disapproval. Again, really nearly a complete reversal. Being a minority, younger, more educated and liberal, and living in the eastern and western states were all traits that were associated with those who think more positively about interracial marriages. But again, I think the headline here is that the public perception has been changing, and it's something that you're also going to, the prevalence rate has also increased. And so you're also likely to be seeing this showing up more in your office. Again, more than a third of adult surveys said that they have an immediate family member or a close relative that is married to someone of a different race. And although this was a little bit more inconsistent, I've seen research on both sides of this, but I think overall it shows that interracial marriages are generally a little bit less stable. I report lower levels of marital happiness than same-race marriages. So again, it's another thing that I think is an important piece to be able to pay attention to. Let's see, I'm gonna fast forward here. Since I'm mindful of the time, I want to get to a couple of other things here. Okay, so I think that in terms of the current state of interracial marriages, the process of developing pride in one's race or culture while not diminishing or devaluing other races and cultures may be foundational for a successful interracial marriage. This is from the Leslie Antique study, and I will tell you in my office that is absolutely the case that I see. When I'm working with interracial couples, the importance of being able to, you have to be able to have that both and perspective and mindset when working with interracial couples. And so it's really about reaching a comfort and respect for both cultures is necessary for the long-term survival of interracial marriages. If they don't have this idea of respect and understanding the importance and the nuances that both have something to bring, then there can be a lot of difficulty, a lot of conflict if couples are not mindful of that. So again, like I mentioned, the subject task of marriage is the management of differences. And so again, we're going to talk about now how we sort of think about some of those findings and the things that we see these trends. What are some of the things that as a clinician that we have to be mindful of as a couple when the couple shows up in our offices? One is, when are the problems due to racial differences and when are they due to relationship issues? You know, some couples, interracial couples, can come in and assume that all of their issues are about race when racial differences are the least of their problems. They have many other bigger fish that they have to be able to fry before that. And there are relationship dynamics that same couples can take for granted, but can be problematic for interracial couples. You know, parenting is probably the biggest one. I'm going to talk a bit more about that, but parenting is really, I think, when, especially assuming that that neither parent is biracial themselves, because that obviously just adds a whole nother level of nuance, but assuming that the parents are not, it is one of the areas that, you know, there's a lot of opportunity and importance for being able to have healthy conversations about, okay, how do we go about parenting a biracial child when neither one of us are biracial, and having to sort of work through that, or issues around discrimination. There's a couple I can think about that I was working with, and you know, the husband, who was African American, had ran into an issue was at a restaurant where that he really was convinced was about racism, and his wife, who was white, just didn't see it. And she actually went through and said, "Hey, I actually don't think that was about race. I think you're being a little bit too sensitive." And I'll tell you, I remember that session vividly because things kind of blew up there in my office at that moment, and we had to do a lot of work at being able to help understand some of the importance of being able to have empathic connections and understand having cultural humility being an important piece for being able to work through this. And I'm going to talk about some of that actually a bit towards the end. But parenting and discrimination can really become big issues that you have to be able to work with interracial couples. So again, like I was just mentioning, is there room to talk about discrimination? How does the person from the dominant culture express empathy when their partner has been the victim of discrimination? I think those two questions, when you're assessing a couple as an interracial couple, I'm always looking for opportunities to be able to understand, are these issues for them? It may be or may not be, but I'm always going to be asking about it so I can make sure I'm doing my thorough assessment and understanding some of the nuances that may be there for a couple. What is each person's story about why they chose each other for interracial couples? Because I think there's a lot of different narratives that interracial couples may have. Some of them, it's about rebellion. Some of it is that, love is blind, that I don't really sort of see race, that it's more about, just about the fundamentals of love. Some people, it's about a multicultural value system, and that's what drives them to the attraction. Others could be about their own racial identity. So sometimes I will ask about sort of, have they always dated outside of the race? Is that something that, is this something that is unique or a first time? Just being able to understand where people are at. And then, of course, there's also this idea mate availability. I can think of this one couple that I'm currently working with. She's African-American, he's white. And she frankly said, yeah, I dated a lot of African-American men, but it was just hard. And none of them actually ever, we had a lot of different problems. We never got to a certain point. And I got to a place where, I was alone for a while. And I was tired of being alone, and I found this guy who I really loved, and we had some challenges, but the mate availability was really a part of why she ended up choosing to be with him. So again, all of these things are things that will pop up in your office, when you're working with couples. How have their families responded? So this is a big one when you're working with interracial couples, because even though public perception has changed, all in all, again, family members, this is where, really the rubber can sometimes hit the road. Interracial couples frequently have to deal with sometimes disapproval from not all extended family members, I'm going to be very clear, but there could be, even one or two that can really be enough to actually lead to disconnecting from these family members and really being an issue. Sometimes it can also be disapproval that can really diminish, or it can heighten following the birth of children. I have found that is an area when an interracial couple comes in and they have a newborn. One of the questions I'm going to ask is how has the family felt about that? Has this been a joyous moment, or has this also been an area where, wow, things were going along well, but now all of a sudden, once we had this child, we started to pick up some of these different challenges and issues that are there. Other issues that I think it's important to be able to assess is social support. Do they have a support network of friends? I can think about this couple that I was working with. They were both in graduate school, about to go off into the workforce, but they were applying for jobs. And one of the things, and they're trying to figure out where they wanted to move. And we had some really interesting conversations about, where do you decide to want to live? And does it matter that there's a place where there are other interracial couples or other people of color? Is that something that's important or not? And it really led to a series of just many sessions talking about it. They had not thought about it in that way before, and it really was impactful. I can think also of this other couple that I dealt with. He was African American and she was white, and they lived out in a predominantly white area. And he really struggled to be out there. He really minimized minimized going into it, sort of the challenges that would occur by living in this predominantly white area. He didn't think it was going to be as much of an issue, but he dealt with a lot of racism and a lot of challenges that were there. And so they actually got to the point where they had to figure out, are we going to move, and are we going to pull our kids out of the school district, because their kids were also dealing with racial issues. And I remember the mother really struggled as well because she had never dealt with, obviously was dealing with race because she was white. And having to deal with the fact, oh my gosh, my children are now, how do I protect my children? So again, I think it's such an important piece to think about the community and the friends and where you choose to live can really have a profound impact in working with interracial couples. Parenting, as I mentioned, do they have disagreements over child rearing practices? Because look, child rearing practices, they're deeply rooted in cultural context. And so sometimes finding a middle ground can be very difficult. We tend our first right exposure to what we think is normative when it comes to parenting. Well, guess what? It comes from our own experiences. How we were parented and what were sort of the cultural norms of our community that actually sort of reinforced some of these cultural contexts. And so I think being able to help couples to have an important conversation when I'm working with a couple, let's say where the woman is pregnant, we're going to talk about, okay, so let's talk about some of the parenting and things out there. And all of a sudden, some of the things that were sometimes went unsaid and they assumed that we were aligned, all of a sudden they realized there were some important differences and there was a real opportunity to help the couple to have better alignment. How do they plan on helping their child develop a cultural and racial identity? Right? This is where, again, this disconnect that can sometimes happen when, a parent of one is Black and the other is white, that neither of them have had the experience of what does it mean to be biracial? And how do we now think about infusing culture into the parenting when neither one of us have had that experience of having multiple races that we're having to deal with? And so helping children negotiate the complexities of racial identity is further complicated when dealing with adolescent developmental issues. I've had some couples come in that really sort of struggle with this. You have this sort of the biracial issues that were there that then got overlaid with adolescent development and having to see those interactions and some of the complexities that came, from that. And so this is something I wanted to be able to read. I think it's a really important piece. I think research has concluded that when an individual from two diverse backgrounds can comfortably create a multicultural identity, the individual has higher self-esteem, higher self-worth, and better mental health, less anxiety and depression related to resiliency factors. And I oftentimes will read a version of that to the couples because I want to be able to set the stage about what were we trying to be able to do here and how can we be able to help to sort of work through this so we can be able to all be on the same page and be aligned with how to be able to have and really create healthy racial identity development. These are a couple of resources that I think that I have found helpful. There's this diversity toolkit on a guide to discussing identity, power, and privilege. And then there's this book, A New Perspectives on Racial Identity Development. But again, I think anything that you can do to be able to get up to speed on what it means to be able to have racial identity and thinking about some of these complexities, I think are really, it's a real important piece here. So step families. So, when it comes to working with step families, I think a couple things are really important. So as I mentioned before, 70% of all African-American children are being born out of wedlock. And so it is almost inevitable that when you're working with couples, at least some of your couples are also going to be a step family or a step couple. And having to sort of help the couple to be able to work through this becomes really important. Step families are the most complicated of all family structures. And unfortunately, I don't think we get enough training in working with step families. But if you're working with African-American couples, you are going to have to be able to have a model and a framework for also thinking about how to be able to work with the couple and family when they happen to be a step family. So first, let's define step family. So we're talking about two adults living with a child or children, where one person has a primary historical relationship with the child or children through conception or adoption. And then two, the other parent exists, whether alive or dead. They might have already passed away, but there's another parent that also exists. This is what we're talking about in terms of with step families. And I think that primary historical relationship is key. And I'm underscoring that because we're going to talk about that in a second here. So how do step families differ from a nuclear family? Well, there's just more complexity that gets into place. You have multiple children sometimes that are members of one or multiple households. There's going to be at least one parent who's absent in that household. There's a lack of shared family history. The parent-child bond predates the couple bond. I can't tell you how many times working with couples that particular notion has become a very important one, which is how do we make room for dating? How do we make room for being able to formulate our us? And then all of a sudden, when there's almost this competition, quote unquote, that can come for spending time, there's having to be a split of time between time spent with, your child and then time spent trying to develop this new relationship. The family life cycles are incongruent. There's a lack of legal and societal supports, and there's a lack of clear role expectations. And so, you can't just simply take a nuclear family ideology and apply it to with a step family. So, I think, some of the problems that can sometimes occur when people are sort of using that nuclear family ideology, there's some problems that can occur. So somehow step family members should just forget about their prior relationships, right? Well, that's not very practical or realistic or helpful with it. The non-residential parent would need to be cut off, or the non-residential parent has to agree to be replaced. Both of those, of course, which are obviously problematic. The parent and step-parent work as a team without any prior experience or practice. So now all of a sudden they're having to figure out how to be able to parent this 10-year-old that they together as a team when they don't have that kind of history together. And that the step parent would have to be willing to accept all of the parenting responsibilities if they were trying to think about this nuclear family ideology. So all of these become really problematic. So you have to have a different framework when beginning to work with step families and step couples. So there's some myths that are there, that love should instantly occur or should occur quickly between the step parent and stepchild. I can think of this African-American couple that I worked with for a while. She was the step parent. He had kids from a previous marriage, and his former wife had passed away. And so there was also a lot of grief work that had to be there. And so it was incredibly complicated for all the obvious reasons that you could think about. And one of the challenges was helping him. He had unrealistic expectations about what her role should be and how quickly she should be able to form that relationship with his children. He was desperate looking for someone to come in for the kids to have a new mom, and having to get through this idea of being able to accept that, okay, that's actually not going to be the case here, but it doesn't mean there can't be a relationship. So let's talk about how to be able to build that. But that took a lot of work. With a couple that sort of was sort of, I think, a quintessential example of some of the challenges that can come up where one parent feels like that the other parent should just equally come in and be able to quickly develop that relationship. Another myth is that the step parent will never be as good as the original, parent. Again, kids are able to build multiple relationships, and they're always like talk about that their hearts are big enough to have more than one relationship, and that this idea that the step parent should just accept their role, and that the step family will be as happy or even happier than the original family. For the person who has their kids, and sometimes it's obviously both members can sometimes have a kid, but they also, when that relationship didn't work with their child's biological father, and now they found each other, they can sometimes think, hey, well, I think this is going to be even a better situation. And sometimes that expectation, putting that pressure, can have a lot of also, again, unintended consequences and difficulties on the family. So what are some typical step family problems that there's again the step parent conflict over children? This idea of how does the step parent build a relationship with the parent? I know that they're going to be in there working together, and so there's a lot of complications that can come from that. Differences in role expectations that I was just mentioning, or differences in perceptions or beliefs about their child, where the biological parent may have a very clear idea about here's my child, and here's how I sort of see them, and the step parent says, yeah, actually I see them in a different way, and all of a sudden those differing perceptions can cause conflict or challenges. Child-centered problems, can be there, right? That you talk to some of the real experts in working with step families, they will say the worst time to get remarried is during adolescence. If you have a kid who is during adolescence, they will say you can date, you can still be in a relationship, but this idea of trying to get married when all of a sudden one of the kids is an adolescent can be very, very difficult. The divorce rate for first marriages is still roughly about 50%, give or take. For second marriages, it's about 75%. And for step families, it's actually 80%. And so it is a very complicated family structure. And one of the headlines is that you have to go slow. And it's hard to be able to force some of these different relationships to just happen. So when you're assessing a step family, where are they stuck? What issue are they particularly stuck in? What are some, do they have realistic expectations about how quickly this should go and what those rules and norms should be? Try to normalize some of the difficulties. I love, I always like to be able to have a lot of empathy for step families when they're coming in and was talking about some of these challenges and the couples there in front of me. I try to normalize, yeah, this is difficult. This is hard. We can get through it, but it's going to take some time. It's going to oftentimes be on a timeline that may be more slow, occur more slowly than you ideally would like, but trying to be able to normalize some of these difficulties, to take away that there's some stigma, something wrong with just them, but it's actually about, the structure of some of the challenges that come with step families. Assessing parenting style, encouraging the step parent to focus on warmth before control. This is another classic one that I've seen with couples that come in where the step parent wants to come in and try to start quote unquote parenting about here are the rules and being the enforcer. And they've done that before they've been able to develop a relationship with them. You get this whole attitude, you get a lot more bees with honey than with vinegar comes to mind here, that you got to be able to have a good relationship, try to develop that. And then as you have that, it makes it a lot easier then to be able to do some of the more stereotypical ideas of parenting around control and things along those lines. So Scott Browning is also a good colleague, dear colleague of mine, and someone who I recommend, if you haven't had a chance to read any of his work, I would highly recommend it because he's done a lot of work with step couples and step families. And some of the common practices that are contraindicated. One, working with the entire system. So if you're working with a couple that's coming in, we're talking about this to then say, okay, hey, let's just go and bring in everyone into the therapy room. Not the best idea. There's a lot of complications there. Traditional hierarchies and boundaries. Enactments and intensity, which is something that is one of the strategies that, as systemically trained therapists we do. You have to be very mindful and careful about doing that within step families. Traditional family rules, the assumption that there's the marital problem and establishing a mutual problem. So all of these are things that you have to be very careful about when you're working, with a step couple. With step family therapy, you have to clarify legal agreements, working with subsystems. So instead of the entire family system that I just talked about in that last slide, working with subsystems can be very helpful. Don't assume shared information. Children won't talk about everything with the new step parent. And so being able to be mindful about that. Minimize some of the volatility. Avoid getting caught in size. Step families and step couples will absolutely pull for you as a therapist to be on different sides, and so to be able to choose who's right and who's wrong. And you always want to try to minimize being caught into that right-wrong dialectic. It can be something that it can be seductive, and you want to really do everything you can to resist being caught into that. Really allowing for separate goals becomes an important part in order as a way to avoid taking sides. A couple other things when I'm working with couples and they're trying to figure out, this is even true when I'm working with divorcing couples, for instance, and we're trying to sort of work through what's the arrangement going to be. Kids really dislike having midweek living arrangements. Midweek dinners are fine, right? This idea that one parent can come and still be able to pick up the kid from school, they go out to dinner, things along those lines. But what matters is oftentimes where they sleep, and having consistency during that quote unquote work week versus the weekend can really be an important piece. Can be very helpful. Realizing that the original parents have the emotional bank account of the old memories of their child. And so that, those old memories really carry us a lot as parents in working with the kids. And so for the step parent who doesn't have that memory, that emotional bank account, that really could be an important sort of metaphor sometimes to be able to use to be able to help contextualize or understand some of the difficulties. These families need more flexibility with flexible boundaries. And kids don't have to love the step parent in order to get along. And so again, some of those ideas, some of those step family myths that, okay, the step parent there has to be this super loving relationship all the time. Well, that's not always going to be the case. And so being able to say, hey, it's okay, but we can still focus on being able to get along, and being able to, again, reset the expectations. So finally, in the few minutes here that we have left before we switch over into the Q&A, I want to talk a little bit about culturally sensitive therapy when working, with couples. As an intercultural couples therapist, I think is really a translator who invites collaboration. And I think taking that, having this be an invitation becomes a really important piece. Be able to accept initial ambiguities, normalize couples' differences and how they complement each other. Pose not knowing as an ethical, collaborative stance of deep respect for the other. I think that becomes a really important piece of being able to have that kind of perspective when working, with couples. Consistent with providing culturally sensitive treatment, it's important for therapists to recognize that there are both common factors and factors that have special meaning within diverse populations. And both of those things are true. And so it's really about, again, you've heard me mention this a few times here tonight, strive for a both and rather than an either or paradigm when trying to understand the unique experiences that face interracial couples, for that matter, or I think for any minority couple, period. I think you want to be able to really, or any couple period, I should say. It's really about, if you have a both and perspective, you're much more likely to be able to say that sort of systemic interactional place with a couple. But when you start focusing on an either or paradigm, you're going to get yourself in trouble. There's many times where I have been not the first therapist that a couple has come to see, maybe the second, third, or fourth couples therapist. And usually I will know that their past therapy didn't work well when one person said, yeah, I had a really good experience. Things went really well. And the other person said, I couldn't stand that therapist. They didn't understand anything about me. Again, it's about the alliance. And I think having a both and paradigm can really be, helpful. Again, it's critical to be mindful that heterogeneity exists within any population. Going back to the very first slide that we talked about here, or one of the earliest ones, heterogeneity is there. And so just because we're talking about all of these different things tonight, with this lecture, they may or may not apply to the couple that's in front of you. So you can never sort of lose that of making sure that you are not over assuming that something applies or under assuming, right? So this is where this idea of hypothesis testing. Test things out. I hope that some of the things that we're talking about here during this lecture can be a hypothesis that you can test out that may or may not be true or accurate for a particular couple that you're currently working with that's in your office. And so being able to have that, I think, is a really nice way to be able to do a bit of a gut check as you're working with a couple. Realize that there are more common factors than there are differences in terms of what constitutes a healthy relationship. However, it's the differences that need to be most understood. It's those differences that we have to be able to pay attention to. So common factors, sure, include things around money and communication difficulties, power struggles, sexual dysfunction, affairs, substance abuse, depression. That affects all couples, African-American couples, interracial couples, you name it. Those are things that all couples will have to be able to deal with. And we know that affiliation and love and attachment are fundamental human needs. And I think it's those basic needs that a couples therapist can use as a starting point for being able to understand and to be able to empathize. Cultivating critical consciousness, and I got to give a shout out to my dear colleague, Melba Nicholson, who I know has worked with in the Ackerman Institute. And she used a lot of this, and I love to be, and when she was presenting this, I really love this. I kind of pilfered some of her ideas here, and I think they just really apply here to the work when working with couples. Empowering you to address your discomfort and unconscious biases and insecurities that facilitate your avoidance of topics that may be important for a couple you're working with, right? So if you're working with a couple and you're overwhelmed by the idea of sort of step issues, or I'm not sure about these issues of discrimination, and I'm not sure if I could be able to sort of talk about that. You want to really make sure that you are aware of some of your areas of discomfort so you can be able to work through as a therapist how to be able to make sure that your discomforts or some of your unconscious biases don't negatively interfere with the couple that you're working with. And critical consciousness is really awareness plus sensitivity, right? It's more than awareness, because awareness is really a cognitive process. And the problem being that you have that when you have awareness without sensitivity, that becomes problematic. And sensitivity is really an effective awareness. And so again, I think all of those become a really important piece of being able to develop that critical consciousness, the awareness plus having the sensitivity. Cultivating critical consciousness, cognition without experiences doesn't really get us anywhere. And one of the things that I just really love this idea that the privileged live in the world of intentionality, and the subjugated live in the world of consequence. That comes up all the time with all types of couples, because you can be, even for an African-American couple, one person in that couple, because of the situation, may be in a particular place of privilege relative to the other, and you will see that communication play out, where the privilege will say, well, that wasn't my intent. I'm not sure why you're being so sensitive to that. You should be able to get over this. It's not that big of an issue. And the other person dealing with, I can't believe what you did. Do you understand how bad that hurt me? And really focusing on the impact of what happened. And so when you can be able to, as a therapist, be able to hold on to that differential, that really, I think, can be I found to be very helpful. And when there's sensitivity, there's awareness of the possibility that what you say may be perceived in a negative way, right? So one thing is, as a couples therapist, that I'm always sort of trying to be aware of is that, I need to know that, hey, I have to have some humility. Maybe it was something that I said may be perceived in a negative way. And I'm also trying to communicate that to the couple, so that the couple is actually also able to have humility with each other, that they may have said something that wasn't their intent, but doesn't mean there wasn't sort of an impact. And so the goal is to really have both awareness and sensitivity. And as the therapist, you want to make sure that you understand what are the parts of you that may be hidden, so that you can enter into that system being as fully present as possible and fully aware of all the different pieces, while still having a good degree of cultural humility. A multidimensional sense of self, I think, is really an important piece that, as therapists, it's important to pay attention to the part of us that are privileged and parts of us that are subjugated. And it's possible to be privileged in one domain and not in the other. And so this is not meant to be an exhaustive list, but I encourage you to be able to think through in those different places around religion and socioeconomic status, your race, your sexual orientation, your gender, family of origin. You can be privileged in some and not privileged in others. And that's true for all of us. And so being able to kind of have that, begin to ask yourself those sorts of questions can help you to be able to increase your level of consciousness when you're working with the couples and families that are in your office. So again, cultivating self-awareness empowers you to address your discomforts and unconscious biases and the insecurities that facilitate the avoidance of topics that are important for relationship happiness. As a therapist, you want to make sure you're not engaged in that avoidance, and that you want to make sure that you are able to say, okay, I need to find a way to help this couple have a difficult conversation, which may even be difficult for me to enter or broach into, but this is about being able to stay centered for the couple that's right there in front of you. The window into our assumptions, as I mentioned before, lie in our decision-making process. I think that's also true, that I mentioned, for the couple. I think it's also true for us as therapists, that the window into our own assumptions lies into the decision about what we choose to bring up, what we choose not to, and we want to be as much clear as possible about whatever assumptions that we may hold. You want to be able to facilitate for the couple curious versus judgmental conversations between you and the couple, and I think this also applies for within the couple. Many times I'm working with a couple, I'm trying to help them to rephrase things in such a way that sort of helps engender curiosity and doesn't come across as judgmental. And I have to be able to try to model that myself. I try to do that with the couple that I'm working with, and being able to say, hey, let's embrace curiosity and let's get curious about why your partner's having the reaction that they're having when clearly that wasn't your intent. Let's sort of figure that out, which is very different than taking framing that exact same thing through the lens of that has more of a judgmental tone. I think as a couple therapist, that becomes a really important piece for the alliance that we're trying to be able to build. So a couple of final questions here. What is your ethnic background? In what locality did you grow up? And what were the other ethnic groups that resided in your community? How did your family see itself as alike or different from other ethnic groups? How did your family see itself as alike or different from families within your ethnic group? And what were your early images of color as an ethnic factor? What are your feelings about your own ethnic identity? And what is it like for you to be able to answer these questions? That all of these are sort of things I think that you can be able to do to go through, your own self-assessment and being able to work with couples. So we've come to the end here. I hope that this was informative, and I hope that this was stimulating as well. I think, Dr. Watson, I got right to 6:28, so I think I had about 2 minutes here to spare with us to be able to transition into the next segment here. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Is it okay for me to use Anthony, since that's what I'm?
Please. We're friends and we're family here.
That's exactly right. I'm like, we'd be formal when we are Marlene and Anthony. Yes, thank you so much for this incredible presentation. It truly was exemplary. And, I really appreciated the clips, and am still pondering, reflecting on them, because they, as you say, were very powerful. And the one with Derek Jeter in terms of the comment about colorless, and and I think it really does show us what happens in terms of your assumptions, and the decision making, so the window, into your assumptions, guide your decision making, so that was really incredible. And of course, the 1619 project, and I too recommend that for everyone. So thank you so very much for this. We have a question here that I'm going to read, and I will just read it in its entirety. I was in an interracial marriage, ended in divorce, and we have one son. I am white and my ex-husband is Black. Our son doesn't want any part of either of us. I believe he is ashamed of me because I'm his white mother. We were very close when he was growing up until the past 5 years ago. I don't know if this question is appropriate for the lecture, but can you talk a little about that and how to deal with an adult mixed race child that is trying to exchange from his mother because I'm white?
Oh, well, that's thank you so much for that question. I mean, first of all, that's an incredibly difficult situation to have to be able to go through. And so oftentimes, and I've actually also have worked with the families in this way, where I actually work with the parents and the adult children. And sometimes, if they're willing to be able to come in for some healing, that can also be a really important context for being able to allow for real healing to occur, because these conversations are incredibly difficult, and it's so easy to get into that dialectic that I was talking about: right, wrong, me versus you. It's all your fault. I'm going to blame you. And I'm not looking at myself. I mean, that sort of that kind of context is just a very difficult one and hard to be able to navigate. So having a third person present, or a professional to be able to help guide that kind of conversation, who can help set the kind of framework and ground rules for having a healthy, productive conversation, becomes, I think, a really important piece, because we're talking about race, you're talking about potentially issues also of gender, the interaction, what's going on right now in the world. Right, we don't live in a bubble. We live in this larger context right now. There's generational differences, things that are happening, post George Floyd, and it's just all types of things that, can come into place. And for a biracial child, it is just, it is difficult. I know I talked about this, but I think it's really worth underscoring this idea of trying to be able to find yourself and identify, okay, so who am I? Because I feel like that, well, I'm not white or fully accepted by whites, and may not be fully accepted sometimes by Blacks. How do I begin to sort of realize who I am? Which is a very fundamental question, and not an easy one. So it's, again, my heart goes out to you personally, and to your family, because I know that's just a very difficult situation that having to navigate.
Yes, thank you. And then a second is the question as to whether or not, when you refer to interracial marriage, are you meaning Black and white? or everybody, like Asians, Hispanic, as Indian?
Everyone. So when I was talking about with the interracial couples, for this particular presentation, and some of the examples I was giving, I was talking about one person being Black, the other person can be, it could be white, could be Asian, Latino, and so really talking about all of them. And there's some, I think, I didn't talk about, some of these different examples, but one that kind of comes to mind, for instance, I can think of this couple where he was African American and she was Asian, and and she was also, on top of that, she was an immigrant. She was, English was not her first language, and so there were also other challenges, not only in the therapy room but between each other around language. That's some of those things that we take for granted when you're working with someone who comes from the same cultural background as you. But that when you have the interracial, intercultural aspect, even things as language can be an issue. And I remember, for instance, when they would get into fights, she felt like she could only be able to articulate herself by going back to the language, to her actual sort of native language, because like she could be able to speak more quickly and she could be able to kind of feel like she could counter. She felt like she was always, quote unquote, losing the fights when she had to then try to translate in her head into sort of, how do I say this in English? And so having to, I remember having to really work with them to help to slow down their conversations in a good way. But yeah, I was talking about all of those complexities that come up. Black, white is the one that gets the most attention because of the issues oftentimes with slavery and things along those lines. But interracial couples across the board are happening with all types of interracial mixing.
Please, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A, or you can use the chat. We will monitor both. I wanted to raise an issue based on a couple that I worked with, and it was a biracial white, Black male partner, and the female was white. And they had a son, and they divorced. And after the divorce, she moved back to her parents' home and decided that her son was going to pass for white. Her family, she had been estranged from her family because they did not want her to marry outside of her white race. And, so when you talk about all those issues, I mean, it becomes really very difficult and very painful, because she felt like she had to do that in order to find acceptance. And I remember her saying to me, I'm so glad that he looks white and that he can pass, because it was the only way her parents would allow her to move back into their home following the divorce.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that is a big issue. I've actually gotten to the point when I'm working with an interracial couple and they're talking about issues with their kids and the parenting and things that are along those lines. I will oftentimes ask to see if I can see a picture of what their children look like, because I don't want to assume, because I have seen where it's biracial, say using Black and white as an example, I have seen where the person clearly looks African American, just by looking at them, and there are times where they actually look white. I would not have known that they were biracial just by being able to look at them. And so it's one of those things that you cannot take for granted, sort of how they actually what their kids actually look like. And the complexion, the skin color in this country in particular, we know does matter, and how they are perceived, and how this child now, when they're trying to then develop their own relationships at school and what have you, let alone in this case that you're talking about with families of origin, who might not be as, progressive or as evolved in their sort of ideas about, a multicultural value system and things along those lines. And so skin color plays a huge role in terms of the experience of that. And so that's a very powerful experience. And the fact that she actually would even say that to you, that's really something.
Yes. And the other thing is siblings, because one may be lighter, one may be darker. And, and then the discrimination that happens between them as a result of that, because of name calling and, different issues around, that, or if one identifies differently than the other in terms of self-identity, then it can be quite problematic as well. And just as you were saying about step families and that we don't get enough training, you know, we sometimes forget about siblings
Yes.
as well.
Yes. Well said, absolutely. That siblings, and I mentioned in there the importance of working with a subsystem. Sometimes you're having to work with the sibling subsystem to
Yeah.
be able to work that. That's a really powerful one. And so that's a very well said, absolutely.
Yes. We have a comment. Can't stay on, but wanted to thank you, Dr. Chambers, for this phenomenal presentation. This will greatly inform my clinical and supervisor practices. So
Well,
I,
thank you.
yes, it has been phenomenal. Anyone else with comments or questions? Okay, I think we have one. What has your experience been with working with Jewish Christian couples families, which are also interracial?
Oh yeah, the great question. Yeah, I actually have a whole nother lecture that I also have given around working with couples of different faiths and different background. And one of the things I will say that is sort of almost also connected or related to with interracial couples. I mentioned earlier about the importance of what happens after the birth of a children, at birth of a child. That is when the issue sometimes of race and the family members can really, extended family members can really come into place. But also for couples, when all of a sudden now they have to make decisions about, okay, so what religion are we going to use to be able to raise our child, and having to make decisions of where to educate them, what's going to be the cultural group that they're a part of, and what does it mean to be able to be, both sort of identifying as Jewish as well as Christian, and is that something that we even believe in, or do we have to make a choice? These are all questions that become really important. So I find as a clinician, one of the things I'm really trying to work with a couple with is trying to be able to at least provide some thoughtful questions for them to begin to have a productive dialogue. I'm not going to have all the answers. I'm not the one that's going to be able to say what they should or shouldn't do, but I'm hoping to have an invitation for the couple to be able to sort of, let's go down this journey and let's talk and let's have a conversation about this and understand some of the nuances, the trade-offs, which most of life is about a trade-off, and how do we sort of think about that, and how does it mean to be able to have identified perhaps with both, and what are the implications to how our extended family members may or may not feel. So I think it's really about having a list of really thoughtful questions that can help the couple to be able to wrestle with some of their own thinking and try to push them to be able to say, oh, I think maybe this is where I come out on this, and I didn't know that until we started to talk about that. And can they do that together? And I think that becomes a really important piece because the issues of religion are just sometimes as powerful as they are with race. I mean, some of the differences in the way that how do we hold on to that? And again, with children, when we begin to say, hey, this is how I get to imprint part of me onto this next generation, there's a lot that kind of comes with that.
Absolutely. And I think it's important when you are working with a couple on those issues, and certainly that was my experience when they have children and with the religion and trying to decide about that, helping them to have those curious and not judgmental conversations becomes critical. And as well, who else is involved, because sometimes, as you said, when there are other family members, you have other people who have a stake in it or feel that they do, that makes it even more complex.
That's well said. That's exactly right. And that's one of the I think developmental goals. When I tend to think about relationships through development and even stages of relationships and things along those lines. And when couples decide to get married, one of those developmental goals, at least in this westernized, society, is to be able to transition your primary allegiance from your family of origin to your new partner. That's part of what you're doing when you're getting married. And having to all of a sudden, to your point, Marlene, I think, when the family member has still very strong opinions about what should or shouldn't happen, that's part of that developmental sometimes, stage that you have to wrestle with and say, well, okay, well, mom, dad, I appreciate you saying that, but this is actually now a conversation between me and my spouse, and we're going to make this decision. I hear your input, but we're going to make this decision. And having to be able to have those sorts of conversations to shift some of those family dynamics as you begin to sort of go through that family life cycle.
Absolutely. And another complicating factor is if the family members are providing some support to the couple, that becomes another
Oh yeah,
layer.
exactly. No, it goes back to that that one slide I said, it's about not only giving something. I mean, you have sometimes a family member you're giving family support to, but also financial support to. But sometimes it's about receiving financial
Yes.
support. And I've
Yes.
had couples where that was just as much of an issue. Why are you still holding on and taking these resources? Because as soon as we take this resource from them, they're going to feel empowered or entitled to be able to say how we should or should not live our lives in certain things, and having more of an input on decisions. So that's very well said.
Yes. Another question is, can you speak to self-disclosure and its use in working with interracial couples with children? I am the product of an African-American white relationship.
Okay, so if I'm hearing the question, sort of right, was in terms of just self-disclosure, I think if you are a clinician, for instance, and you're biracial, and you think sometimes that could be helpful. I think it's all about, to me, it's all about the alliance. Right, and we know the alliance is the most predictive of how work happens in therapy. And so if you are there's different ways to be able to help bolster that alliance. And self-disclosure is obviously a technique that a lot of therapists will use to be able to bolster that alliance. I think sometimes it's also, you have to be mindful or careful that you're doing it for their service and it's not about you. I mean, be careful about sort of what you're choosing to disclose. But sometimes that can be helpful. That can be a real opportunity, for being able to have a better understanding. Because if all of a sudden your client's system is aware of, oh, wait a minute, so you kind of have gone through X, Y, or Z, that can be very helpful. When you read my bio, I self-disclose on there that I am married, that I've been married for over 20 years, and that I have a daughter. That I didn't have to, but I do put that out there. And so when a couple comes in, they know that, oh, I know that you have a daughter that you were working with, and that sometimes will be an area for us to be able to talk about. But so I think self-disclosure can be, when used appropriately, can be a way to be able to have to bolster your alliance with that couple.
Mhm. Okay. Also, this was a comment that was put in the chat, and so I'll just say it for all the participants who are on. It was a comment that Jewish is an ethnicity and cultural group as well as a religion.
Yes, well said, absolutely.
And the other is, good evening. Thank you for a great presentation. You spoke about the historical impact on Black people, specifically breeding during our enslavement. Can you please address the historical implications of Black women being sexually abused by white men, many coming into the couple's homes and not being protected by Black men during times of vulnerability, especially since this particular issue existed well into the 20th century?
No, it's been that clip I thought was just a really powerful moment, and it really sort of shows some of the trauma, the intergenerational trauma that has continued to occur, and being able to see some of those origins of where that came from. The other part that I didn't show in that clip, with that, they also made sure that there were laws that the race of the child took on the mother, because they didn't want to be able to have the benefits of the white father who was obviously who raped the women. I mean, it was just horrific. But you see some of these intergenerational patterns that still come up. I talked about a little bit even with the infidelity that's there, that forced infidelity that occurred. I mean, just so many things where you see some of the things that are happening today or in the very recent past. You can link back to sort of these things were occurring generations ago, and I think it's really been one of the real difficulties. One of the things that I didn't talk about, but this question really brings it up for me. I've oftentimes, when I'm working with a couple and they've had trauma of any sort that has occurred, that's not an uncommon thing, especially as therapists. We're going to have couples that come in who've had different types of trauma. And one of the things that I oftentimes will try to, I really conceptualize and I try to help the couple to be able to see is, can they use their relationship or their marriage as a context for healing? where they can be able to now have a different type of experience with each other, a different way of communicating, a different level of empathy, of understanding, of how do we care for each other, and versus where the relationship becomes a context of repeated injury, emotional injury, it can continue trauma and things along those lines. And so I think this is, again, one of the opportunities, I think one of the privileges that we have as therapists, when we can be able to help create that context for healing. And all of a sudden, some of the most powerful moments I've had with couples in therapy have been through that, of being able to allow for a different tone, a different level of where there's curiosity and not judgment. Judgment is very much will all of a sudden just re-aggravate trauma when you're feeling judged by whatever X, Y, or Z, versus being able to be curious, to have empathy, gentleness, and we try to take care of each other. And we can realize that we can sometimes both have trauma and we can both also be there for each other. And I think that's just such an important piece to being able to realize some of these historical, antecedents that really help to shape where things are today.
Yes. In your presentation, you said that interracial couples are more successful when both have pride in their race and are able to stand in their race with each other. Cannot remember the exact statement. Have you ever seen a Black male, white female relationship in which the white woman feels more comfortable within the Black community in many respects, and how this may impact the relationship?
A good question. Let me think about that. What I have seen is, I can think of one couple where the white woman felt like that her identity was more mired in feeling like she sort of more identified with the have-nots than the haves. She had different challenges from her background growing up. And so she felt more connected to the African-American experience. In terms of, unfortunately, in this society, we know, if there's a problem that's sort of out there, we're either at the top of the bad list or the bottom of a good list of different factors that are there. And she identified with that. And so that was a ways that I think why she sort of felt like that actually she was able to connect, and why she felt more comfortable dating Black men. She'd only dated Black men actually as a result of that. So so that is something that that can be there to have experienced that.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Or Anthony, is there anything that you maybe in the interest of time didn't say? We have 10 minutes and that you'd like to express?
Well, I guess I'll just take this opportunity to, again, reiterate my thanks to you for this invitation. I love being able to talk about, couples. Again, I just like to be able to reiterate, there's just such an opportunity. When we, I think the family structure, when I devoted my career to working, with couples across all racial and ethnic backgrounds, I think the couple relationship is fascinating. I think it's something that there's a real opportunity for healing and for us to thrive. And it's a way that we can actually begin to give back to the next generation. I actually started off the quick anecdote here working with children, and I started realizing through graduate school that a lot of the kids' problems were sometimes reacting to what was going on with their parents, and I felt like if I could actually be able to help that couple relationship, I could help the entire family. And so I all these years later, I still get excited about a couple that comes in. I'm always I'm pushed, I'm challenged, I feel oftentimes rejuvenated and humbled by the couples and the families that I'm able to work with. And I hope that for those of you who are clinicians who are working with them, to really see that as a real opportunity and a gift to be able to work with a couple and family and to do our small part to be able to try to help people to do something that we're all biologically, I think, something we wired to do. We're all looking for relationships and we want them to be successful. And when they work well, it's a true blessing. And when it doesn't work well, it can be a lot of trauma. And so being able to, work with them in the right way is just something that I love doing. So I appreciate the opportunity to be able to be here tonight and to be able to talk about this with this distinguished group here through the Ackerman Institute.